right, welcome everyone. It's end of May and it's a smaller group today. I think a lot of people are at graduations. I'm actually at my college reunion. So we're all traveling and doing our thing. So um that said, it is one of the great chapters of Arendt's work or oeuvre. Her thinking about Socrates um in many ways is one of the heights of Arendt's writing. There's a number of essays that she dedicates to Socrates. Um, One is published in The Problem of Politics, uh, and then there's these two in sections 17 and 18 here in The Life of the Mind. Um, and I think there's no doubt that, as she said in section 17 that we talked about last week, um, the choice of Socrates is not accidental. Um, she sees Socrates as her model of thinking, and I mean, obviously, she's not the only one in Western philosophy who has sought to um, model her own thinking in many ways on Socrates, which doesn't mean everything Socrates says is Arendtian, or that Arendt is nothing but Socrates. That is not the point at all. It's simply that she does come to see and offer Socrates as the model for thinking. So section 18 is the last section in chapter 3 of The Life of the Mind. And chapter 3 of The Life of the Mind, as we've talked about, is called What Makes Us Think. And she says that, well, we're not gonna sort of give an answer of like a cause of thinking. But okay, what makes us think? What is it that drives us human beings to think? And in chapter 3, we've had a number of answers, right? For the Greeks, what makes us think is, she says, something like the experience of the unity and the affirmation of the meaningfulness of the world. We think because we're struck by wonder, you know, that the stars are there for a reason, or that the waves lapping on the shore, you know, give us a sense of harmony and purpose, that the world makes sense. We hear bird songs, or we see a mathematical theorem, or we come up with the law of gravity, and we're struck out of wonder that this world really does seem not just random and not just an accident. You see a sculpture by Michelangelo, or a painting by Van Gogh or Rembrandt, and you think, we can all agree this is beautiful. There's something that joins all this together. And out of this affirming wonder, not out of puzzlement, but out of this affirming wonder of the unity of the meaning of the world, um, we think there must be some sort of invisible harmony in the cosmos, and we think, and so that's the Greek answer, the Platonic and Greek answer. The Roman answer to the question of what makes us think is that is not that. It's sort of almost the opposite. We're struck by the disunity of the world, the way the world is being torn apart, and that it doesn't make sense, and we need to put it back together. And so, for the Romans, thinking is a cure. It's sort of a practical, useful means to live amidst the destruction. Um, and we have to sort of figure out how to live a life. And thinking becomes what the Greek word is, a techne, or a tool, or a means, a technology to work on yourself at a time in which the world is beyond repair. And so the wise man for the Romans is one who stands apart and has no feeling, has apathos. Um, there's a refusal to react to whatever happens to you, a keeping a distance from both good and evil, because both good and evil can make you too caught up in the world and thus lose your equilibrium. And so there's a turning away from the world to the self. Um, and so with these two models, the Greek and the Roman model, um, Arendt says, that they both are different ways that we come to think. But she wants to pursue a different model, which is the model of Socrates. And for Socrates, what makes us think is not necessarily that we sense the unity of the world, because, I mean, let's be honest that Arendt is living, she thinks, post World War II, amidst the break in tradition, amidst at a time, I should say, when she thinks it not irrational to believe that there is no meaning in the world post Holocaust, right? What does it mean to live and to believe in the beauty and harmony and purpose of the Holocaust, right? I mean, there are those who said the Holocaust serves a purpose, right? It reminds us it tells us what totalitarianism can be, and shows us certain evils and allows us to therefore recoil from them. And one can make the argument that in a kind of theodicy-like universe, God gives mankind horrors like the Holocaust or Stalinism in order to, remind us of the importance of not getting caught up in ideological movements. But Arendt is not really going to go there, right? And she says, we can't just count on, the fact that the world makes sense. And while, the Romans, she respects greatly for their sort of, reality based thinking, and that the world doesn't necessarily make sense, that the turn away from the world to the self in the Romans um, uh, is one that for her ignores that part of what it means to be a human is to live in a community. And that even though much of what happens in the public realm is fake and filled with corruption and fame and things that don't really matter, um, uh, she thinks that politics, the concern with the common good, the res publica, the public thing, um, are not to be neglected, and so she has some worry about the Roman answer to what makes us think as well, and so she turns to Socrates, and she has two chapters here on Socrates. The first one we talked about last week, where she says that what makes us think for Socrates is that there's meaning in thinking itself, right? Thinking itself is to be fully alive. Um, and we go through some of the core elements of Socratic thinking, that it's aporetic, or it moves in circles. It doesn't accomplish anything. The word house, is a frozen concept. Thinking can unfreeze it, but it doesn't tell us what a house should be. She thinks that talking and thinking go together in a very important way, and that talking about concepts like piety and justice won't tell you what piety and justice are, but will make the world more pious and more just. Not by giving definitions of piety and justice, but by building in our conversation common sense understandings of what piety and justice are. And she talks about how for Socrates, there's this gadfly, midwife, and stingray metaphor, image that he embellishes, and that thinking is a kind of arousing us and making us think and waking us from our dogmatic slumbers so that we see our prejudices and we purge ourselves and others of opinions and we paralyze ourselves so that we're alive in this highest state of thought. And then she offers this metaphor of thinking as the wind of thought or the storm, and that to write and philosophize is to some degree to seek refuge from the wind of thought. And so that philosophy is sort of counter to thinking in this way. In all thinking, she concludes that there's a danger, right? The destructive undermining of all established criteria and rules of ethics and morality. And the great danger is that those who are aroused to think come to say, oh, well, therefore, all the rules of morality and piety are just conventions and not real. And therefore, if there isn't any impious, then if there isn't any impiety, I might as well be impious. And there's a kind of inherent nihilism in thinking. It destroys all conventions, which is why she can say that there are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. And the profundity of that line of Arendt's, thinking is dangerous, right? Thinking destroys, it tears apart. It has inherent nihilism in it. But, right, also not thinking is dangerous, because if you don't think, you simply obey the conventions and the rules. And since the conventions and the rules can be replaced quite easily, you can suddenly start finding yourself obeying horrific conventions and rules. And it's just amazing how easy it is to, in a couple of weeks, go from rules in which you don't arrest people at churches and schools and during court hearings to when you suddenly say, yes, it's convenient to arrest people at churches and schools and court hearings because we know they'll be there. And so you begin doing so and you just follow the new rules and you don't think about it very much. And so the danger of not thinking is dangerous. And also is the danger of thinking. And she leaves us with that. For Socrates, she says, a life deprived of thinking would be meaningless. We find the meaning of thinking in the activity of thinking itself. But that doesn't tell us that thinking makes us better people or makes us worse people. It doesn't tell us how to deal with evil, right? And we have to remember that we started this book by raising this question of, is there a sense in which, or a possibility in which, the activity of thinking might be able to prophylactically prevent evil. And that's how she begins this second chapter on Socrates, which we read for today, section 18, the 2 in 1. She asks, where does this leave us with the guiding question of the book about the possible connection of thoughtlessness and evil? And she says, for Plato, he says, well, the noble think, and they're driven by this eros of wisdom, and they could be relied on. But as she says, okay, but what about the rest of us? Socrates talked with everybody. He cannot have believed with Plato that only those who, are the true thinkers, are those that can rule and lead. And so, in a more democratic spirit, which she finds in Socrates, we have to ask this question again. If thinking can prevent evil, it must be something inherent in the activity of thinking itself, regardless of the results. It's not that thinking leads to some conclusion or tells us what to do. Thinking is dangerous, it destroys. Not thinking is dangerous, it leads to conventionality. but is there a way in which thinking itself can prevent evil? And she says, all right, to pursue this question, we're going to look at the two of the very few positive statements that Socrates ever makes, right? Socrates is generally someone who asks questions. He doesn't offer dogma. And yet there are some periods, some points in his text where he makes a statement. And in both of these statements are taken from the dialogue, the Gorgias, the Platonic dialogue, the Gorgias, which is famous for being Plato's inquiry into rhetoric. Rhetoric being the art of addressing and convincing the many. And so in such a dialogue, Socrates makes positive statements that Plato puts in his mouth, but that are thought to then be, we're supposed to persuade the people of. And the two statements, just to lay them out there, are fundamental statements at the very core of Western moral thinking. Arendt writes about this in many of her texts and books. The first one is that it is better to be wronged or to suffer wrong than to do wrong, right? It is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. What this of course is also something that Socrates elaborates in the Credo, in which he explains why he will not escape Athens after the judgment against him in the Apology. And Credo says to him, but the judgment against you was wrong, right? And you should not die, you should escape. And Socrates says, well, it's better to be wronged than to do wrong. He says that if I were to escape, I would be wronging the laws of Athens. And yes, you're right, Credo, I was wronged, right? The judgment against me was a wrong judgment. We say in our moralism today, two wrongs don't make a right. And in a way, that's a modern day rephrasing of it is better to be wronged than to do wrong. But Socrates means something, I think, much deeper by it, which is that if I wrong the laws of Athens, right, I do a real wrong. And the wrong I do is that I say that I have the right to break the laws of Athens because Athens did something wrong to me. So two wrongs. I commit a crime because a crime was committed against me. I commit a wrong because a wrong was committed against me. The wrong here is a kind of pride in a Christian sense. It's to say that, the wrong against me gives me the right to elevate myself over the laws and do a wrong. And certainly within a Christian context, this wrong of pride is considered to be the first great sin. Socrates doesn't put it in those terms, but there is a hubris. There is a kind of hubris in this. And he says that I can't let myself be a wrongdoer. And so I must suffer the wrong rather than do another wrong. The second statement is that it would be better for me that my lyre, the instrument I play, or a chorus that I direct, should be out of tune and loud with discord, and that multitudes of men should disagree with me. So it's better for me that, my music is out of tune, my chorus is out of tune, I'm out of tune with the community, people disagree with me, then rather than that I, being one, should be out of harmony with myself and contradict me, right? The worst thing I can do is be out of tune with myself. Um, and Callicles, who Socrates is speaking to in the Gorgias on both these occasions, says, "You're a nutcase," right? Of course, it's better to wrong another than to be wronged yourself. I mean, how can you say that? And secondly, this is a funny statement to say that it's better to, all these things are better than simply that you're out of tune with yourself. Who cares? And Arendt says that for Socrates, though, these statements come not from any sense of morality or usefulness, right? But from the experience of thinking itself. So in the first one, it is better to be wronged than to do wrong. She says it's purely subjective. It's better for me to be wrong than to do wrong. And I gave the example of the Apology. Another, I think, great example from literature is the story of Billy Budd by Herman Melville, right? Some of you know it, I'm sure, but in that story, Billy Budd is presented as an absolute innocent, a Christ-like figure, who is accused by Claggart of a mutiny, and he didn't do it, but he's so innocent and so aghast that when he's accused, he shoots out his arm and knocks Claggart dead, and he's put on trial, and everyone knows that he's innocent. He shouldn't be convicted, and yet it's during a war, and they have to convict him. And at the end of the book, the Captain Vere goes to talk to Billy, and we don't know what he says to him. Melville tells us, he said something to him. We don't know what. And then Billy comes out, and as they're hanging him, he says, "God bless Captain Vere." And I think one of the great mysteries of American literature is why? Why does Billy Budd say "God bless Captain Vere" when Captain Vere is killing him for no reason or no good reason, because Billy is clearly innocent? And one of my mentors, Philippe Nonet, who sadly passed away a few years ago, but taught me much of what I know of philosophy and reading, I think offered the only sensible interpretation of that passage, which is that what Vere told Billy is, "Billy, you're innocent, but if you were to protest your innocence, you would be doing a wrong. You would be putting yourself and your own interests above the needs of this ship, which is at war and needs to keep order. And you have to, in a sense, sacrifice yourself to the common good, because it's better to suffer wrong than to do a wrong." And Billy, in his innocence, embraces that and says, "God bless Captain Vere." And I think that is very much the spirit in which Arendt here presents this, with the one exception that there's a morality to that view. Um, uh, and for Arendt, Socrates doesn't speak this from the question of morality. He speaks it as a thinker. He says that if you love wisdom, if you're a thinker, this is how you think. That the love that the reason you do, that it's better to suffer wrong than do wrong, is not the moral reason that to do wrong is a sin or a crime in the Christian sense, but that you can't live with yourself as a thinker who has to be in conversation with yourself, who has to go home to yourself if you commit a wrong. And so it's not a moral argument, it's an argument of a thinker who won't be able to live with himself. And this brings us to the second proposition, right? That you can't be out of agreement with yourself. That in yourself, you're always a two in one. You're always thinking and talking to yourself in that moment of solitude. And so for Arendt, there's this idea that plurality is inherent in ourselves, not simply as beings, right? And this is where she disagrees with Plato and Heidegger in this passage. It's not simply that I am I am different from myself for myself because every self, has a kind of difference in it ontologically. That's not her argument, right? That's Plato's argument, if you believe Heidegger, and it's Heidegger's argument. But Arendt says plurality is inherent not in things, but in the activity of thinking, and thus in thinking beings. Thinking for her is existentially speaking is solitary, not lonely. In thinking, man exists essentially in the plural, in his solitude, his consciousness of himself, and his duality in thinking. And thus, in the two in one, in which I think with myself as one person, but in division, um, the one can again become one when someone else speaks to me, and the two now has to become one, and I speak as one to answer them, right? It cuts short the thinking process. But insofar as I'm thinking, this duality with myself makes thinking a true activity in which I ask and answer myself. And the criterion of this activity of thinking, she says, is not morality and is not truth. It is simply an agreement with myself that I can't be in contradiction to myself because I can't possibly want to be with myself if I don't respect myself. Um, what this means is that the criterion for thinking is not morality and is not truth, it's friendship. She says on page 177 in the critical edition, friendship with myself means that friendship and not selfhood is the guiding experience in the matters of thinking. What we care about is being a friend to ourselves in the way Aristotle once put it. And she offers the example of Richard III from Shakespeare, who is worried has committed murder and what does he fear? He says, and the famous line, "What do I fear? Myself. There's none else," right? I fear that I have to be with myself when I'm alone. Richard loves Richard. That is, I am I. Right. So, okay, then he says, no, I'm just one. There's nothing, there's no division here, no duality. Is there a murderer here? No, I'm not a murderer. I'm Richard. I do what I think. Oh, yes, I am. Right. Then fly. What from? Myself? Great reason why. Lest I revenge. What? Myself upon myself? Alack, I love myself. Wherefore, for any good that I myself have done unto myself. Okay, I mean, I should let James Kybert or somebody here act. I'm not an actor. But the point here is that Richard is enacting this two-in-one conversation in the Shakespearean play. And then she says it looks and in that moment, he doesn't want to live with himself if he's not himself, if he's a murderer. And so he has to deny it, and yet it keeps coming back. And this being lack of agreement with oneself is the way in which thinking develops conscience. And she says, though, when Richard escapes his own company, when he's no longer in solitude and he's with other people, conscience goes away, right? Conscience is there when you have to think with yourself and talk about yourself, and your conscience keeps saying, well, what about this? What about this? But later, when Richard is with other people, conscience is but a word that cowards use, devised at first to keep the strong in awe. He stops thinking and conscience disappears. The point Arendt is making is that everyone can think, but also non-thinking is possible. And conscience is connected to thinking in the sense that we have to constantly be conscious of ourselves and have to live with ourselves for what we have done. Thinking, she says, has no use. And yet there can be moral and political side effects to thinking. And here is where she develops this other extremely powerful idea that when I think normally, right, I'm just in conversation with myself and I'm, wondering if I should do this or if, and she says it never tells me what I should do, but thinking can stop me, right? The classic image is Socrates walking down the street towards the symposium, or and he just stops in the middle of the street and stands there for 8 hours. And what we're told is a daemon, his little demon, appears on his shoulder. And the demon, Socrates says, appears when he's about to do something that he thinks is that might be wrong. The demon is the sign of him thinking, of him questioning himself. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it raises the question: should you be doing this? And she says that this happens in thought. We usually go home and should I have cheated on that test, or should I have, cursed at my friend, or whatever it is. And we think, and it doesn't usually have much impact on the world. But in these boundary situations, at times when there's a crisis in the world, when the chips are down, and everyone is going along and deporting people, or going along and uh, you know uh, uh, condemning immigrants, or whatever it is. It's the person who stops and refuses to act and refuses to participate, who by that very refusal, that stopping and thinking, manifest their thinking in a world in a way that makes other people maybe stop and think. And that's the beginning of what she thinks of as the way that thinking and the activity of thinking itself can, in a meaningful way, be a prophylactic, a way to protect against the doing of evil. Thinking is made manifest in that stopping. And she says this manifestation of the wind of thought is not knowledge, but it is the ability to tell right from wrong or beautiful from ugly. It's the person who knows that something is wrong, maybe doesn't know what is right, but knows something is wrong, and stops, that manifests thinking in the world. And this, she says, may indeed prevent catastrophes, at least for the thinker themselves. It stops them from doing it in the rare moments when the chips are down. Will it stop others? That depends. Depends how powerful the thinker is, how respected they are, how much people are willing to listen. We can't ever know that our thinking, our refusal to act, will impact others, and yet it can at least protect ourselves. Now, there's a way in which this is, for Arendt, deeply unpolitical, right? Insofar as it only protects myself. In her essay on civil disobedience, she actually criticizes Thoreau for imagining that civil disobedience is an act of conscience, because it concerns itself only with myself and me not dirtying my hands, as she puts it. Whereas for her, civil disobedience is always the activity of an organized minority and not an individual. So, but for her, thinking is not civil disobedience, right? Thinking has not yet reached the level of an organized minority. It's something done by an individual with themselves. Whether it can lead to civil disobedience, when it can lead to political action, is not a matter of thinking. Thinking itself has nothing to do with that. It simply can protect oneself and maybe inspire others. So that brings us to chapter 4. Where are we when we think? And I think I had said we would discuss chapter 9, section 19, which is short. I'll do a very brief account of it, because I think the focus today will probably be on chapter 18. Basically, she's jumping off of Paul Valéry's line, "Now I think, now I am." Um, uh, the idea that thinking and being, right there, I think, therefore I am, from Descartes, is this question of, well, where am I when I think? And the general answer is nowhere. She develops four ideas. She says that might seem like dogmas, but they're not. The first is that thinking is out of order, right? Thinking always pulls us out of the world. Secondly, that there are many ways of thinking, that the thinking ego manifests itself in the world as an authentic semblance, or the two world theory, which we've discussed in chapter 1. That thinking is a withdrawal, and it deals with absences, and it desenses the world. It leaves the world of particulars into generals. And then finally, that thinking is homeless. It's cosmopolitan. When we think, we are not, as Valéry would say. She says, but the mistake to some degree in this approach is to think that thinking is spatial, and that if there's no place, then thinking doesn't have you in the world, and that thinking exits the world. But she says, actually, thinking is discursive. It takes place in time. And it's not necessarily the case that just because in thinking you're not in a place, that thinking, therefore, is fully outside the world. And that's going to lead into sections 20 and then this postscript, the transition, in which he raises the question of how thinking can create a space, a temporal space, what she calls this gap between past and future, that is meaningful in the world, even though it is nowhere in space. So we'll get to that more when we reconvene. I think Yana told me it was in 2 weeks. So we'll get to there then. But I think
we do have a section next week, and then we're off the week after, just to make sure.
Okay. So next week we're reading section. I think we're finishing the section on thinking, right?
Next week, June 6th, is section 20 and 21, and then we don't have a session on June 13.
Great. So we will finish the first book of The Life of the Mind on thinking next week, and we'll focus more on this question of where are we when we think, which may also be thought of as when and where are we when we think, in this gap between past and future. And then there's the transition, which is actually a fascinating little text on the question between thinking and judgment, which we'll get to as well. Well, why don't I've talked for a while. Why don't I stop here for now and open it up for questions? I do agree with what James Kyberd said earlier, which is this is an extraordinary chapter, and I think this whole book is extraordinary on thinking. And I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Yana, if you don't mind and you're able to, if there are any good questions in the chat that you want to highlight at any point, let me know. Or if other people find really interesting discussions or questions in the chat that they want to bring to my attention, and raise your hand and bring them to my attention. I just can't answer your questions and attend to you and read the chat at the same time. And I'm happy to if people in the chat say things that you think is important, I'm happy to bring that out. Otherwise, go down to the react button, click on the raise your hand, and enter the conversation. Jeff, you're up.
Good morning. But just two housekeeping items. I didn't see anything about chapter 4 in this week's reading, so my question will be about chapter 3. And I wasn't going to bring it up, but I spent a whole night watching all your lectures from 3 years ago, I guess, on revolution, because it's a Herman Melville group, right? And so we were going to talk about the whole book, and I'm like, the whole book? I can't read that whole book in 1 week. And so your lecture saved me there, and I had plenty to talk about for that. So it was really nice. Those are really good. Those are from just before I joined the center. actually.
Well, that's great.
19,
I,
19.
oh, go ahead.
Well, so then I have a question, and it's simple, but I'm just holding it back 1 second because I just want the answer might take a while, or I mean, I don't care if we answer it now or if it just comes out later in the conversation. I'm here for the whole hour and a half. But the quote the quote that really got me going in this chapter is about halfway through. If you look at 187 in the McCarthy version, there's this one section. It's not a section or whatever. It's like, you know, it's blocked off. You know, it's one paragraph that's blocked off by itself. I don't think I've ever seen that in Arendt, actually. And in the middle of that paragraph is the thing that knocked me over here. Right after, without consciousness in the sense of self-awareness, thinking might be possible. That's not too hard to believe. What thinking actualizes in its unending process is difference, given as a mere raw fact, factum brutum, in consciousness. Only in this humanized form does consciousness then become the outstanding characteristic, I think that's an important word, of somebody who is a man and neither a god nor an animal. So if in your answer to my question, which isn't going to be that hard to explain, that you could get to that, that'd be wonderful. But you know, you don't feel compelled. So my question though is it's somewhat challenging. You know, it's the question is of the whole chapter 3 is what makes us think. And we finished chapter 3, and I don't think I understand the answer. What makes us think? Not how does thinking, you know, filter into morality or so forth, but what is the reason that what is the cause? And that's the way I take that question to be. And so I have an answer for things. It's I don't want to give a lecture or something. So I just want to see. I want to get some other senses of that. But I'm looking for a direct answer to the question of the chapter. What makes us think?
Well, yeah, thanks, Jeff. You know, I mean, she gives a number of answers, right? For the Greeks, for the Romans. I think her answer, right, given in these 2 chapters on Socrates, is that what makes us think is the experience of our existential and essential difference within ourself. That we are, when we come home and we close the door and we're no longer with others, we are alone, but not by ourselves, or we're with my other self. And that this experience of being with myself, and the internal dialogue that I carry on with myself, is the activity of thinking. What makes us think, right? You know, well, nothing, in the sense that we don't have to think. There are, most of the time we don't think. And, you know, many people probably almost never think. Or they have an inkling of it and they push it away because it's so dangerous and so scary. So it's not that there's a one thing that causes us to think. She thinks that in that act of thinking, of talking with oneself discursively and challenging oneself and asking questions of oneself, she thinks that there is a feeling of being alive, a feeling of joy, of love, and that we feel most human and most ourselves when we are thinking. And so it's not that there's a causality, because we may not think, but to those, all of us have the capacity to think, she believes, and to those of us who do, when we do, we think because we love it. And we feel alive even when it is destructive and damaging to our ego. But it makes us feel human. That's why.
On Monday, I'll be getting into it more deeply, but thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. John.
Yeah, I'm still trying to understand the 2-in-1 and the dialogue between me and myself. And there's a crack by Kenneth Burke. He translates Gnosthi Seaton as spy on thyself, rather than know thyself. And I'm just wondering if a way to understand that is that we can imagine another self. We reflect on what we do, and then we imagine somebody judging us. All right, this is the daimon, the Socratic daimon. And so my question is it the faculty of the imagination that enables us to do this? To imagine another self. That's all.
I don't think so. There's two different, it's a good question, and there's two levels to it. So she doesn't really mention the faculty of imagination here. Where she talks about the faculty of imagination quite a bit is in her writings and lectures on judgment.
Right.
And in judging, she says, we use the imagination to bring other people into the conversation. So even though we're alone in our solitude, we think, what would Plato say? And what would Heidegger say? And what would Hitler say? And what would Mao say? And what would Thoreau say? And we bring all these different people into the conversation so that we can challenge our own judgments and make a judgment that is the most public, the most common sense, the one that reaches to the widest sensus communis, and thus is one that could be true for a political community. And so the imagination plays an essential role in political judgment for Arendt, and aesthetic judgment, by the way. But in thinking, I'm not so much trying to think, well, what would all these other people say? I'm trying to have a conversation with myself, right? And I don't really need to imagine myself to have that conversation. To the extent I have a daemon, right? He's part of me, or she's part of me, or they are part of me. And they pop up on my shoulder, obviously, not visibly, but there, as a way of me asking myself, is that really who I am? Is that what I am? Am I someone who would murder? Am I someone who would steal? And so you know, I mean, could one put the imagination into that conversation? I don't know. But I don't think you need to, because it's me speaking silently with myself. Now, in judgment, I'm also speaking silently with myself, but I call up these other public figures and I'm interested in a public judgment. But this is an important distinction, right? Thinking and judgment are not the same, even though they're very closely related. And it goes to something of what I said before about the difference between thinking and civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is still an act of multiple people, of a minority, an organized minority, whereas thinking for Arendt is still only an act of myself. And I don't have to build a public world. I don't have to imagine a public world. I just have to talk to myself. And I don't think I have to imagine that. I think I can just do it. She calls it we all have this essential duality or plurality within us. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to I'm not going to go to bat and say there's no imagination in thinking. I don't know if that would be correct to say either, but I don't think imagination is central to her idea of thinking.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. James.
Yeah, so Roger, I had a lot of fun with this chapter. And I get to the top of 190,
Are you in 190 in which book?
this one.
Okay, so can you tell me the paragraph? Because I'm using the other book.
Last sentence in the top paragraph, Socrates, so much in love with the marketplace, has to go home where he will be alone in solitude in order to meet the other fellow.
This is in the discussion of Hippias Major.
Yes. And that flipped me out, the other fellow. So I came home and I met my other fellow. And I said,
Well, good for you.
no, James, there is an other fellow. You got to talk to him. And it's you, and it's you, and it's you. And I've been puzzling what is going on in the world today. I don't experience the categorical imperative or the lumen natural or the voice of God. It feels as though we're being administrated by a group of people that don't have other fellows at home or have the lumen natural or the voice of God or the categorical imperative. They're ignoring it. It's not part of the discussion. It's not part of the world that that we live in. And it feels like it's evidenced every time, every day.
I have to say, I think you're right. Early on in the deportation whirlwind, which has been, in my mind, perhaps the most disturbing of all the disturbing elements of what's going on in our country, the United States. When the young woman from Tufts who was abducted on the street and then whisked down to Louisiana, who thankfully now has been released, when she was in the car with the agents from, I think it was ICE, I don't know for sure, she says that one of the agents said to her, "Don't think we're all bad people." That interchange or exchange that she reports, I think is one that raises fundamental questions that Arendt is engaged with about thinking and about banality of evil and complicity and not thinking. Here was a young man, right, in a car with a young woman who was clearly scared and was a PhD student and had been in the United States for many years from Turkey. And he knew enough to say, don't think we're all bad people. Oh, what he said is, don't think we're all bad people. We're just doing our jobs and following the law, right? I mean, it's sort of a classic bureaucratic answer. Um, Arendt says here in the book I'm using, which is about a page before where you were reading. So in the paragraph that begins right after the Richard III speech, she says, I drew your attention to the passage in Hippias Major, right? In its stark simplicity, because it offers a simile with the help of which we can simplify, at the risk of oversimplification, matters which are difficult and therefore always in danger of overcomplication. So we want to simplify, but there's a danger here that we have to be aware of oversimplifying. She says, later times have given this fellow, the fellow you found at home, James, this fellow who awaits Socrates in his home, the name of conscience, before whose tribunal, in Kantian language, we have to appear and give account of ourselves. And then she makes this distinction. She says that originally conscience and consciousness were the same word and the same idea, and they've become separated out. So what is conscience as opposed from consciousness? Well, it's not, as you said, the lumen naturale, the light of God, or the voice of God, or the light of nature. For her, this conscience is an afterthought. It's what appears afterwards and is aroused, that thought which is aroused by a crime, or as in the case of Richard himself, or by an unexamined opinion. So, one could imagine this young ICE officer going home that night and having a crisis of conscience, right? Not because God tells him he's wrong or right, but because he's worried about whether he is a good person or not. And he has to decide, do I follow the law, right? I mean, and this is the problem that Arendt identifies in the Eichmann book, in the chapter on the duties of a law-abiding citizen, which is that there are plenty of times in history in which the law, which is generally supposed to be an imposition of justice, becomes unjust, and following the law becomes an act of injustice, and the temptation to break the law is actually a temptation in the name of justice. These things happen, and what she says is, in Eichmann, is that Eichmann came to see his moral responsibility as following the law and putting his own personal morality to the side when the law required him to do something he thought was wrong. And he thought that that was actually the duty of a law-abiding citizen. I think this young man who was in the car with the arrested woman, and said, I'm just doing my job, we're not bad people, was having that same crisis of conscience. At the end of this, at the end of this paragraph,
When Eichmann, okay, go ahead.
at the
Sorry.
end of this paragraph, she's talking about how what makes a man fear this conscience is the anticipation of the presence of a witness who awaits him only if and when he goes home. We fear the conscience because it's when we're home when we start to worry, what have I done? Right? And she says below, it's not a matter of wickedness or goodness, as it is not a matter of intelligence or stupidity, right? It's not that Eichmann was wicked or good, or that he was intelligent or stupid. She continues, he who does not know the intercourse between me and myself, in which we examine what we say and what we do, will not mind contradicting himself. So if you don't have someone waiting for you at home, you won't mind contradicting your conscience because you never encounter it. You never force yourself into that problem. And this means he will never be able or willing to give account of what he says or does. Nor will he mind committing any crime, since he can be sure that it will be forgotten the next moment. If you don't have the fellow waiting at home for you, crimes are okay because you don't have to live with them. Bad people, Aristotle to the contrary notwithstanding, are not full of regrets. People who regret what they've done are not bad people. Bad people are the ones who never regret it.
That's kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah, the
We're
problem
living-
today is that, we've created this shamelessness. There's almost a pride right now in the public sphere of those who can be shameless and not feel regret. I mean, the classic text of here, of course, is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov's desire to prove himself not a louse, to prove himself a great man who can commit a crime and not be bothered by it. And the whole psychological torture of the novel is his inability to turn off his conscience. And eventually he has to, spoiler alert if you're not read Crime and Punishment, but shame on you for not having read Crime and, no, I'm just kidding. Go and read Crime and Punishment. But he has to, bend down at the crossroads, the cross, in the middle of St. Petersburg and repent. Because in the end, he realizes that he can't escape his conscience, and that his crime is something he can't live with. It then even gets more complicated than that in the epilogue, so we'll leave that for now. Truly the greatest book about conscience ever written, and if you're interested in it, I highly recommend you reread it or read it many times. Yes, James, I'm sorry, I went on a little bit of a tangent.
No. I feel as though we're surrounded. I mean, everybody that's on this call, everybody that's in the group, I feel confident in their ability to go home and meet this other person. The people that we're meeting now that have arisen in the last few months or years have no conscience. They don't operate that way. And it's just how it is. It's just how it is. We gotta face it. What do we do?
So, I mean, I deeply hear where you're coming from, and I don't, and I think a lot of it is where I'm coming from too. I mean, all I'll say is, I think there's a lot of people, I don't want to say the people on this call or not, but a lot of people who have not gone home to themselves over the last 10 or 20 years, quite confident in their knowledge of what is right and wrong, and their willingness to condemn certain people for things those people have said, or maybe thoughtfully said, or maybe did or not done. There has been an incredible sense of entitlement and arrogance amongst many people in power over the last 20 years that they knew what is right, and that they were acting in the right, and I think they didn't question themselves. And so this is not to excuse them or this wild overreaction that we are experiencing today. Not at all. And it's not to equate them. But it is to say that I don't think you can understand or make sense of this wild, shameless lack of consciousness that we're seeing today without understanding it as a reaction and a sense of resentful, justified reaction against an entire class and system of people who didn't question themselves for many years and maybe even decades.
It's
And
the whole community of Eichmanns. We're growing little Eichmanns.
well, I mean, I think it's very hard to think, and I think it's hard to think for people on all political sides of the spectrum. Um, I don't want to equate them. I think that there's the reaction right now is out of proportion to what they believe has caused it. But you're right. I mean, Arendt did not like the phrase "there's a little Eichmann in all of us" because, or there were all little Eichmanns, because she believed that we have, all of us, the potential to think and thus to stop and not be Eichmanns.
Amen.
But that doesn't mean that there aren't very many Eichmanns. Yeah, that there are many Eichmanns around us, and there are on by the way, I think on all sides, and that is important to acknowledge, which is not to excuse their actions on any side.
If anyone has a place for me to go and work on this, I would love them to send me a link.
Well, let me say that there's different solutions that Arendt offers, right? Or different responses. One is to think.
Yes,
She says thinking has no effects. Accepting maybe that it'll save you from doing something wrong and maybe influence some others. The more political response is organizing a political community, and that's called politics, or if you can't win, civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is Arendt's response to this. So, I think, I've been writing about this the last 3 months, pretty much every day, every week. It's time for the problem the left has right now is that they can't decide what their civil disobedience is for, because they still can't agree what they believe in, because there's left is split and heartless and soulless right now, and they don't know where they are. They don't know if they're, they don't know what their issues are, and that's the problem. But someone, and you're starting to see it, but you're going to have to see organized civil disobedience in which people risk their freedom and their rights and their lives to make a political point.
sign me up.
I think someone's got to start organizing, and I think it's going to happen. We'll see. Let me move on. Patty.
Thank you. So I'm a neophyte in this group, but I'm going to courageously, if not quite fearlessly, throw my hat in the ring here. And because I read something in the New York Review of Books in the latest issue, it was in a review of Daniel Kellman, the German writer Daniel Kellman. And this comment that I read started to make, suddenly things started coming together about everything I've been reading and what you've been saying and what we've been talking about here. And I'm not sure exactly why, but I'm going to read the quote and then I'm going to ask the question. But my question also relates to this idea of consciousness versus conscience from the reading. So Daniel Kellman is quoting, he's talking about Kertész, I hope I haven't pronounced the name wrong, who wrote about...
Can you just say it again? Because I don't know who that is. Or
he wrote about imprisonment in Auschwitz.
Okay.
Kertész, Kertesz.
Okay.
Imre Kertész. I'm going to read part of the quote. It's a couple of sentences. Kertész has made us understand that the scandal of Auschwitz is not limited to the bestial industrialized violence, but that what happened there makes us all forever lost. Anyone who still claims a destiny for themselves must now ascribe one to the murdered millions. And because this implication is monstrous, indecent, absurd, and morally unacceptable, we too have lost our destiny with those who rose as smoke into the air.
Yeah.
And I thought of, he also mentions, Hannah Arendt is mentioned in this review, but This was-
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Patty, oh, go ahead.
Well, so it brought to my mind the idea of what she's talking about between truth and meaning when we think, and about judging and morality. And I think sometimes in our country we ascribe thinking, which is why I've been having trouble thinking of Hannah Arendt's idea of thinking. We give thinking this idea that there's going to be some social value in it, that there's going to be some outcome, some conclusion. I think for me, American culture is kind of guilty of that. And I wonder if it's somehow that there is no conclusion. And even though there's a value in thinking, that where we end up is what is as maybe blank as that blackboard behind you, that there isn't a conclusion. There isn't oh, right, now here's the value of it. Here's the social thing. But maybe just, is she saying that there's an inherence in thinking, and that's all. That's the only goal we can have in thinking.
Yeah. So first of all, Patty, thanks for throwing your hat in the ring and welcome to the group. And it's a great question. I haven't read the review or the book that the review is of, so I preface whatever I'm going to say with that. I think that if I understand the way you presented it, there's a concordance between what this man is saying and Arendt's idea that we post World War II, with the break in tradition, the sort of fundamental brokenness of Western culture and tradition, we can't just assume with the Greeks that there's this wondrous affirmation, right? And that we have to, and that's where she enters and says, no, we have to sort of think out of this break in tradition without a destiny, without a sense that we know the answer. And yet thinking still for her, as an existential activity, has meaning without truth or morality necessarily attached to it. And yet one of the impacts of it is it can protect us from doing evil. And that I think is her claim, Patty. And I think it goes very much along with the review that you're citing, which again I haven't read, so it's hard for me to say much about it. But
Thank you.
Thank you. Dina.
Hi there. You spoke earlier of living in a society of shamelessness and not feeling regret. And I'm wondering if we're also living alongside that aspect of society, in a society of paralysis, where the left is not just heartless and soulless, but where maybe we're placing such a high demand on ourselves of moral purity that small acts of civil disobedience are not really contemplated, because our demand on ourselves is that single-handedly we stop the deportations, for example, or that we exceed the sort of prerogative of being in friendship with ourselves and act as morally pure agents, and that we sort of feel a sense of paralysis because we cannot act in this morally pure or absolutely morally pure way. And so we don't act at all. We don't even engage in the small things that our particular lives might permit us to do.
Yeah. I mean, look, these are good questions, and I'm not sure I think there's a lot of smart people around the world and the country trying to understand what's going on right now. And I'm not, I am one of them, but I don't know if I have the right answers. I think there's a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. I think, but I to go back to something I was saying, I think to James, I think many people who consider themselves, maybe part of a resistance right now, or whatever you want to call it, have not yet come to terms with the corruption of our culture, the left culture as well, the liberal culture, the establishment culture. I mean, the unwillingness of certain law firms to stand up for justice and to negotiate and to bend their knee. The unwillingness of so many universities, the vast majority of them, to stand up for what they believe is education, and to try and protect themselves and their jobs and their money. I mean, I get it. But there is a sense of, at least as I understand it, of people not really yet understanding that this is a fight for core values, and they still think, we can negotiate our way out of it and we can somehow win or something like that. I think that that there's gonna have to become, I mean, it's hard to imagine, but I think that there's gonna have to be a bigger crisis before people are willing to risk their security, their status, and their safety. And I don't think we're there yet. I think that's unfortunately the answer I have.
There's some glimmer of hope with the many lawsuits that are starting to come out more and
Yeah.
more.
So Hannah, you're absolutely right, but I've said this many
And
times.
that's very minor, and I just don't disagree with you at all
I'll-
about a thing you've said. I'm just
I'll say it again
a
about
little bit.
lawsuits. The law is a temporary stopgap,
Yeah.
but the law will always be defeated by power.
Right.
And at some point, the laws will buckle. The judges will be replaced. The judges will be, imprisoned. I mean, who knows what? But the judges are working right now, and that's one of the reasons we have this, illusion of things, and not illusion. We are not in a fascist world yet, and we still are in a world of the rule of law, but it's being challenged. But unless political power is organized against political power, the judges can't hold out forever. That's all. And that's a Arendtian view. And it's one I
agree with you 100%. Excuse me for butting in.
That's
I
all
just
right.
had to say that.
I got a bunch of people. I'm going to try and get to them. So I don't know the name of this. Halan? I'm sorry.
Hi, sorry, it's Monica Williams. Hello. I just want to say I'm so grateful for this forum, and it's really helping tie up a lot of threads of ideas over time. But we're in the throes of this, to build off of what James said. We're in the throes of this project called The Great War for Value Creation, and that's studying Taylor Swift's Tortured Poets Department album and her Eras tour, and the themes of like Greek mythology and that she's tying into that, and that I'm making the case that she's kind of our Socrates, and has maybe even written like the modern Iliad of our time, and I'll tie back to that. But when I was in college, I went to Evergreen State College, and I ended with an independent learning contract on Hannah Arendt. And I left with that, just like with this mission, like you have to get thinking into the world. That's what I was pursuing. And the first entrepreneurial project I did was with, and I've shared it here in this forum a couple of times, but I adapted Susan Nyman's Evil and Modern Thought book into a digital media project. And we filmed that in 2007 at the Institute for Advanced Study. And it, like throughout, it was self-funded and volunteer, like a lot of people kind of chipped in to help. But I'd always thought, okay, well, if I make a good product and it's approved by Nyman and all that it would, be supported and get somewhere. But I had this weird reaction with her publishers. They like called and said, you can't, like, you can share this, but you can never like make money off of it. And I just thought it just set off this series of kind of emotions and thinking like, well, you've got my intentions like wrong here. I wasn't trying to, anyways, whatever. But I was, after processing all of that, I was thinking, well, maybe I'll just go back to get my master's.
Do you have, I just could just quickly, because we got a bunch of people. Is there a question you want to get to, or?
Well, I just wanted to tie it up. I think I'm kind of talking about, I kind of bumped into a Socratic type figure when he was working at a school doing inquiry-based learning. And his name's Jim Ross, and he had also like pioneered digital photography and industrial design in Detroit. And his experiences in doing that were really interesting. And he had pioneered the RGB color space model for the web. And then worked at the McMath-Hulbert Solar Observatory to kind of bring inquiry-based learning to K through 12. And to kind of tie that back to the original about Taylor Swift and how that's kind of producing
Well,
a
I
forum
love
in
this.
the world.
I love this.
I'm tying to it, but I'm just going to wrap it up right now. But her work right now is doing like it has a synthesis built within it, like a very cathartic. It deals with Cassandra, and it deals with like the prophecy. It has a lot of those themes in it. And then in the album, there's a synthesis that kind of shows that she's like playing this joke on the NFL, like in real time right now. And I just wanted to say that like throughout the whole process, the album itself, it like produces catharsis. Its own like mechanism of catharsis is built within it. And through like studying it, I've come to see Hannah as like as more of a, I always saw her as very distant. Like in Rana Faruhar's book Homecoming, she talks about there's the anywheres that are the cosmopolitans, but then there's the somewheres who are rooted somewhere, and like I'm rooted in Detroit. So I always felt that Hannah was a very distant figure for me. But like through that whole process, I've come to see her like more of a friend, and like more like us like helping inform like our design process. This is our design thinking process that we use to introduce thinking to those K through 12 environments. And that's what I think James was bringing up, is that there's we don't teach thinking in school. Like it's completely absent. So
I'm gonna have to. I think a lot of what you said is really important, and I have to admit that the idea of Taylor Swift as the Socratic figure is extraordinary.
I'll share my project with you and be citing this group within it, so it'll make more sense.
The one thing I'll hold up in support of your argument is that there's a play on in New York called John Proctor is the Villain, a reading of The Crucible, and Taylor Swift is the figure that makes the young people in that movie think, and so it's worth, and that movie, the play. So it's
is that available at like is it
you have to come to New York and see it.
Okay.
Which I highly recommend. All right, we're gonna move on. Francesca.
Yeah. Hi, Roger, and thank you. It's about the end of the third chapter, the end of the paragraph 18. Ahrens describes thinking very quickly and judging. So she writes, if thinking, the two-in-one of the soundless dialogue actualize the difference, and a few lines later, she writes, then judging, the byproduct of the liberating effect of thinking, realized thinking, makes it manifest in the world of appearance, and so on.
Yep.
So I have a question, but seen from two different directions. The first direction is needs thinking, judging. The second direction is if the world of appearance didn't exist and there were only the world of ideas, would there be the activity of judging?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good questions, Francesca. So, the relation between thinking and judging is difficult, but I think you've picked on to some things. It's not that thinking needs judging. You can think without judging, but judging needs thinking, because you need to liberate yourself from the everyday and free yourself to then use the imagination to think of different possible outcomes in order to judge them. Similarly, without thinking, well, there would be no world at all. But without judging, there would be what you need in a world of appearance to judge, because in judging, you judge particulars from the world of appearance, whereas thinking, you don't need the world of appearance. You sort of do, because we still think in language, and language still comes from the world of appearance, and there's the bridge between language and the world. But thinking can largely, once you have language, can largely free itself from the world of appearance, whereas judging can't, because it has to judge particulars, and that's an important distinction. So yes, thanks for bringing that up. Vigdis.
Yeah, I have a comment or a question related to conscience, which I think is quite a difficult concept. And Owen says, this is on page 178 in the critical edition. She says this conscience, as we use it in moral or legal matters, supposedly is always present within us, just like consciousness. But this is not the Socratic conscience. That is, this conscience from Socrates, unlike the voice of God within us, or the lumen naturale, gives no positive prescriptions. And I think this is the kind of difficulty with conscience, because it makes conscience in a way without any basic values. You have nothing to go on. It's the thinking in itself that have to create something that you in a way don't have. Most people, I think, will relate conscience to values or religion or upbringing or something. Do you have a comment? So it's a kind, like she talks about two different kinds of conscience.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, conscience is the afterthought, and it's the person we come home to. It's not the same as consciousness. I think that's exactly right, and I think you've picked up on it quite well. And so, that is core to her reading. I'm not sure. I mean, I think I agree with what you said. I'm not sure if there's a further question there.
No, just the difficulty with how people think of conscience.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people think of conscience as some sort of universal truth, or word of God or something like that, and that's certainly not how Arendt sees it.
No.
Okay.
So yeah, it's interesting to think about, and it's difficult.
It is. All right. Well, thank you all very much. So we now finished with book 3. We will read, chapter 3. We'll read chapter 4, the whole chapter 4, which is not that long, for next week. And look forward to seeing you next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week. Thanks all very much.